Come on, old man, and see what's left for you to fight for.
More than you'll ever understand.
They thought he was just another old man with nothing left to give. They laughed at the way he shuffled, at the stories he told. But they didn't see the quiet fire in his eyes, or the debt written in scars they could never understand. They laughed at the old man, until 6 Navy SEALs rose in his defense. Subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video, because respect is never optional, and some debts echo louder than any shout. The morning was bright, a pale winter sun glancing off the cold glass of the coffee shop window. Inside, the air was warm, alive with the low hum of conversation and the comforting scent of roasted beans. The old man sat at his usual table, a small corner near the window, his hands wrapped around a chipped white mug. His name was Henry, though most people didn't bother to ask. He was just another old veteran, shoulders bent beneath a worn brown coat, eyes distant and steady in the hush of the morning. The staff knew him by his order, black coffee, no sugar, and by the quiet way he offered a soft thank you whenever it arrived. Today, a group of young men in expensive suits had taken the table next to his. They spoke in loud, easy voices, laughter bubbling over the quiet like the snap of a whip. At first, they ignored him, their focus on their screens and the quick shuffle of business that didn't leave room for old soldiers or their slow, measured breathing. But as the minutes passed, the hush of Henry's quiet presence seemed to grate on them. One of the young men leaned back, his eyes flicking to the old man with a smirk. "You hear that, boys?" he said, his voice pitched just loud enough. "Sounds like the war stories are starting up again." Another laughed, the sound harsh against the warm light of the morning. "Bet he's telling the same ones he's been spinning for years," he said. "Probably can't even remember if they're true." Henry didn't turn his head. He sipped his coffee slowly, the bitter warmth of it steady in his hands. The weight of their laughter settled around him like an old, familiar coat. Not heavy, but worn smooth by years of knowing how to let the world's noise roll off his shoulders. But the young men weren't content to let it lie. One of them, the loudest, the one with the slick hair and the shiny watch, leaned forward, his voice sharp as he met Henry's steady gaze. "Hey, old man," he said, the words a sneer. "Why don't you leave the stories to people who actually matter?" The coffee shop fell quiet around them, the low hum of conversation pausing like a held breath. Henry didn't flinch. He just took another slow sip of coffee, the small motion a quiet stand that spoke louder than any shout. "I served," he said simply, his voice low and calm. "That's enough." The young man's smirk widened, the edge of it cruel. "Yeah, well, we served too," he said, lifting his coffee cup in a mocking salute. "Lattes and spreadsheets. The world's moved on, old man." Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. The hush of the room had already spoken for him, the quiet weight of respect in the eyes of those who understood. But before anyone could speak again, the door opened with a soft jingle of bells. 6 men stepped inside, their movements quiet and precise. They wore simple jackets, but there was something in the way they held themselves, the easy balance, the calm watchfulness, that spoke of a different kind of service. They were Navy SEALs, though none of them wore the trident on their chest today. They didn't need to. They saw the old man, the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders, the calm way he met the world's laughter with the quiet weight of someone who had already seen more than they could imagine. And without a word, they moved, taking the table beside him, the quiet weight of their presence settling like a promise. Henry looked up, his eyes meeting theirs for a long, silent moment. And in that hush, the young men's laughter faltered. Because respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you stand for. And in that small, quiet coffee shop, 6 Navy SEALs rose in his defense. Not with noise, not with threats, but with the simple, silent promise that no one who had ever carried the weight of service would stand alone. The hush that settled over the coffee shop was deep and certain, like the soft weight of snow on a quiet morning. The 6 SEALs took their places around Henry's small table, the calm precision of their movements a quiet echo of years spent standing in the shadow of noise. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The young men in their expensive suits shifted in their chairs, laughter dying in their throats as they took in the calm, measured gaze of the soldiers who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The oldest of the SEALs, a man with close-cropped hair and a scar that traced the line of his jaw, met Henry's eyes and offered a small, respectful nod. "Sir," he said softly, his voice low but carrying. "May we join you?" Henry inclined his head, the smallest of movements, but enough. "You're always welcome," he said, his voice calm as the hush that had settled around them. The SEALs pulled up chairs, their presence filling the small corner of the room like a tide. They didn't speak of medals or battles. They didn't need to. The quiet weight of their presence was enough. A simple testament to the bond that ran deeper than years or noise. The young men shifted again, their confident smirks turning uncertain in the calm. One of them cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the nearest SEAL, a man whose calm gaze met his without a flicker of emotion. "Look," he said, his voice a forced chuckle. "We were just joking around. No harm meant." The SEAL didn't smile. He didn't even blink. "He's earned his place," he said quietly, his voice a calm rumble. "You don't get to decide whether it matters." The young man's mouth opened, but no words came out. In the hush, the weight of the moment pressed down around him, the quiet surety of men who knew that respect wasn't a courtesy. It was a debt. Henry sipped his coffee, his hand steady on the worn ceramic. He didn't speak, but his silence spoke volumes, a quiet refusal to be moved by the world's laughter. The SEALs turned their attention back to him, the warmth in their eyes a soft promise. "We've heard about you, sir," the scarred SEAL said, his voice low. "Your service, your sacrifice. It matters. You matter." Henry met his gaze, his eyes calm and clear. "It was a long time ago," he said simply. The SEAL's mouth twitched into the faintest of smiles. "It was yesterday," he said softly. "For men like us, it's always yesterday." The young men said nothing. They didn't need to. The hush had already spoken for them, the quiet weight of a truth they could no longer laugh away. Henry set his cup down, the small clink of ceramic on wood a quiet punctuation in the hush. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for standing." The SEAL inclined his head, the small motion a promise. "Always," he said, "for men like you, always." And in that quiet corner of a city coffee shop, the old man and the soldiers who had come to stand with him shared a silence that spoke louder than any shout. Because respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you stand for. And some debts, the quiet ones, the steady ones, are paid in the hush of men who know what it means to hold the line. The coffee shop slowly came back to life around them, the muted hum of conversation creeping in at the edges of the hush. But the quiet around Henry's table held, a small island of respect in the warm swirl of voices and the hiss of steam from the barista's machine. Henry sat with his back straight, his eyes calm as he studied the 6 men around him. He didn't need to ask their names. He didn't need to know their stories. In the simple, quiet weight of their presence, he saw the echo of every man he'd ever served with, the same calm surety, the same steady strength. The SEAL with the scar traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam. "What unit were you with, sir?" he asked quietly. Henry's lips curved in a small, almost wistful smile. "Infantry," he said simply. "Vietnam. A lifetime ago." The SEAL nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "We still carry it," he said. "All of it, no matter how many years pass." Henry let out a slow breath, the truth of that settling into the quiet places of his chest. "It never leaves," he said softly. "It becomes a part of you, the weight, the promise." One of the younger SEALs, a man with kind eyes and hands that looked too steady for the noise of the world, leaned forward, his voice low. "We know," he said. "That's why we're here." The young men in suits had gone silent, their laughter swallowed by the quiet respect that hung like a banner over the table. One of them shifted, his gaze falling away from the old man's face, the flush of shame creeping up the back of his neck. Henry didn't look at them. He didn't need to. His focus was on the 6 men who had come to stand, not for him but with him. "I never asked for thanks," he said. I never wanted it. All I ever wanted was to know that what we did mattered. The seal with the scar met his gaze, his voice calm and sure. It matters, he said. Every man who stands in the quiet, every man who doesn't move when the world says sit, that matters. Henry closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of those words sinking into his bones like the warmth of the coffee in his hands. When he opened them again, he saw not just the soldiers who sat with him, but the long line of men who had carried the same weight, the quiet thread of loyalty that wove through every breath. Bear shifted at his feet, his tail thumping softly against the worn wood floor. Henry reached down, his hand resting in the thick fur, the dog's steady presence an anchor in the hush. The scarred seal's mouth twitched in a faint smile. He knows, he said softly. They always do. Henry's lips curved in a quiet smile. He's a good boy, he said. Always has been. The young man in the suit who had spoken first cleared his throat, his voice small and uncertain. I'm sorry, he said finally. I didn't understand. Henry turned to him then, his gaze calm but unflinching. You don't have to understand, he said softly. You just have to remember. And in that moment, in the soft hush of a coffee shop that had learned, if only for a breath, to see beyond the noise, the laughter that had once filled the air was replaced by something quieter, something stronger. Because respect isn't given. It's earned in the quiet places of men who choose to stand. The young man who had laughed first sat with his head bowed, the flush of shame still lingering at his throat. His hands fidgeted in his lap, the polished watch on his wrist a bright glint that seemed suddenly out of place in the hush of the small shop. Henry didn't say more. He didn't need to. The quiet weight of the seal's presence and the calm surety in his own silence spoke louder than any lecture. The barista moved quietly behind the counter, her eyes soft as they flicked to the table where the 6 seals sat, their calm gaze and still shoulders a quiet shield. She set a fresh pot of coffee on the warmer, the small clink of the carafe a gentle counterpoint to the low murmur of voices around the room. The scarred seal took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said softly, it's easy to forget that every old man you see was once young, that every story you think is worn out was once paid for in blood. His voice was low, but it carried a soft thread of truth that cut through the last of the young men's bravado. We don't stand for noise, he said. We stand for the debt we owe to those who stood before us. Henry's fingers tapped lightly on the rim of his cup, a small, steady beat in the hush. It's not about glory, he said. It never was. It's about the quiet promise we made to each other, to the ones we left behind. One of the seals, the youngest of the 6, his eyes bright but steady, shifted in his chair. We know, he said. That promise never dies. The young man in the suit looked up then, his eyes wide and a little lost. I didn't mean to, he began, but the words faltered. He swallowed hard, his voice a hoarse whisper. I just didn't think it mattered anymore. Henry met his gaze, the calm surety in his eyes unwavering. It always matters, he said quietly, even when you're too young to see it, even when you're too loud to hear it. The young man's breath caught, his shoulders slumping. He looked down again, the weight of the moment settling into his chest. The seal with the scar watched him for a moment, then nodded once, a quiet gesture of understanding. It's not about being perfect, he said. It's about being willing to listen, to learn. Henry took another sip of his coffee, the warmth of it steady in his hands. Around them, the shop began to hum again, the low murmur of conversation returning, but softer now, touched by the hush that had settled like a gentle snowfall. Bear shifted at his feet, the dog's head resting on his knee, a soft exhale of breath in the calm. Henry reached down, his fingers brushing the thick fur in a slow, steady rhythm. The seals didn't speak more. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough, a quiet promise that some stands didn't need to be loud to be heard. Because in the end, respect isn't something you demand. It's something you stand for. In the quiet hush of a coffee shop, in the steady breath of an old man who refuses to be moved, and in the silence that followed, the laughter was gone. replaced by something stronger, something that would echo long after the last cup was poured. The last of the morning light spilled through the tall windows, painting the coffee shop in a gentle gold. The laughter of the young men had faded completely now, replaced by the soft hum of conversation, and by the deeper hush that held the quiet corner where Henry sat. The seals remained a calm circle around him, their presence steady and certain. They didn't crowd him, didn't demand to be noticed. They simply sat, each sip of coffee, each quiet word, a testament to the bond that ran deeper than any uniform. Henry's eyes moved over them, a soft smile curving his mouth. "It's good to see," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Good to see that the promise doesn't end when the war does." The scarred seal inclined his head, his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "It never does," he said. "We carry it forward. That's what matters." Henry nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the handle of his cane. "That's what I always believed," he said. "That what we did wouldn't be lost. That it would live on, in the quiet strength of men who understand." One of the younger seals leaned forward, his voice low and sure. "It does," he said. "You're living proof of that. And so are we." The young men in suits sat in silence, their eyes downcast, the weight of the moment pressed into their shoulders. One of them shifted, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply looked at Henry, and in that gaze was the quiet apology he couldn't find the voice to give. Henry saw it, the silent recognition, the soft crack in the bright armor of youth that had once believed it knew everything. And he understood, because he had been that young once, too. He offered the smallest of nods, a quiet acknowledgement that some lessons couldn't be taught with words, only with the soft weight of silence, and the steady breath of men who had learned to stand. Bear nudged his leg, the dog's head resting warm and steady against his knee. Henry reached down, his hand curling in the thick fur. "Good boy," he murmured, the soft words a thread of comfort in the hush. The barista moved quietly through the shop, her steps light as she refilled cups and cleared away empty plates. When she reached their table, she paused for a moment, her eyes meeting Henry's with a small, gentle smile. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked softly. Henry shook his head, his voice calm. "No, thank you," he said. "This is enough." She nodded, the kindness in her gaze a quiet echo of the respect that had settled around the table like a promise. Then she moved away, the clink of cups and the low murmur of conversation returning to the air. The seal with the scar sat back in his chair, his eyes steady on Henry. "It's good to see you, sir," he said. "To be reminded of what matters." Henry's smile was quiet, but it reached his eyes. "It's good to be seen," he said. "And good to remember that none of us ever truly stand alone." And in that soft, steady hush, in the calm breath of men who had learned that the quietest stands often mattered most, the laughter of the world outside seemed very far away. Because in the end, it was never about the noise. It was about the quiet choice to stand, and about the silent echo that lived on in the hearts of those who knew how to listen. The coffee shop had settled into a gentle murmur by the time the seals stood to leave. Their movements were unhurried, precise, the quiet rhythm of men who carried the weight of their choices with calm certainty. The scarred seal met Henry's gaze, his expression warm but steady. "If you ever need us, sir," he said, his voice low and even, "you know where to find us." Henry's lips curved in a small smile. "I know," he said softly, "and that's enough." The youngest seal offered his hand, his eyes bright with the quiet weight of respect. "Thank you, sir," he said, "for showing us how to stand." Henry took his hand, the grip firm and sure. "It's not about teaching," he said. "It's about remembering, and never letting the world tell you what matters." The young man nodded once, the simple motion a promise. Then the seals moved away, their boots quiet on the worn wood floor, the hush of their departure a soft echo in the calm. The young men in suits sat in silence, their laughter long gone, replaced by the quiet knowledge of a moment that had shifted something inside them. One of them looked up, his eyes meeting Henry's with a kind of fragile understanding. "I didn't know," he said softly. I didn't know it meant so much. Henry's gaze was calm, his voice gentle. It always does, he said, even when you're too young to see it. The young man swallowed, his mouth working around words that wouldn't come. In the end, he just nodded, the smallest of movements, but enough. Henry let the moment settle, the quiet weight of it a balm in the hush. Then he rose slowly, his hand steady on the worn wood of his cane. Bear pressed close to his leg, his dark eyes calm and sure. The barista paused as he moved past, her voice soft. Thank you, sir, she said, for everything. Henry offered her a gentle smile. Thank you, he said, for seeing. He stepped out into the pale light of the morning, the cold air crisp against his face. The street was quiet, the soft rush of passing cars and the distant bark of a dog the only sounds in the hush. He paused for a moment, his breath a slow exhale in the cold. Bear pressed close, his head lifting to meet his gaze. Ready, boy? Henry asked, his voice soft but sure. Bear's tail thumped once, the quiet promise of a friend who would never leave. And so they walked, an old man and his dog, moving through a world that had learned, if only for a moment, to see the quiet weight of what it meant to stand. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the noise, not the laughter that faded as quickly as it rose, but the soft, steady echo of a man who refused to be moved. And in that hush, the world kept turning. A little softer, a little steadier, for the quiet choice of a man who had never learned how to sit down when it mattered. The next morning, the coffee shop felt different. Henry could feel it in the hush that settled over the room as he stepped inside, Bear moving close at his side. There was no laughter from the young men this time, no smirks or sideways glances. Just a quiet respect that filled the warm air like the soft scent of roasted coffee beans. He moved to his usual table by the window, the worn seat that had become as familiar as the steady weight of his cane. The barista met his gaze with a small smile, her hands moving deftly as she poured his coffee. It's on the house today, she said softly. For you. Henry inclined his head in quiet thanks. He didn't need to speak. The moment was enough. As he sipped the hot, bitter brew, he let his eyes drift over the quiet murmur of the room. The young men who had once laughed now sat in a hush of their own, their eyes lowered, their hands still. They didn't look at him, not out of shame, but out of the new knowledge that had settled into the lines of their faces. One of them, the one who had mocked him the most, looked up for a moment, his gaze meeting Henry's in the soft light. There was no smirk now, no edge of arrogance in his shoulders, just a quiet, open respect. Henry offered the smallest of nods. It was enough. The door opened and a chill gust of winter air swept through the room. A man in an old army jacket stepped inside, his shoulders broad beneath the worn fabric, his eyes the same deep, quiet calm that Henry recognized in the seals. He paused when he saw Henry, his mouth lifting in a small smile. Mind if I join you, sir? He asked softly. Henry gestured to the seat across from him, the quiet weight of the moment shared in the hush that followed. Please, he said, always room for one more. And in that small, warm corner of the city, two old soldiers sat together, not to tell stories, but simply to share the weight of a world that had never learned to listen. Because sometimes, the quiet of understanding spoke louder than any shout. The man in the army jacket, Thomas, sat across from Henry, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. The two men didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. In the hush of the coffee shop, their silence was a language all its own. Thomas let out a long breath, his gaze steady on the swirl of steam rising from his cup. You know, he said finally, his voice low and even, I've been coming to this place for years. Never thought I'd see another man who understands. Henry met his eyes, a small, understanding smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It's not about seeing, he said softly. It's about knowing. Thomas nodded, the lines of his face softening. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, he said. Came back to a world that didn't know how to look at me, like they'd never seen a uniform before, like they'd never heard the quiet that comes after the noise. Henry sipped his coffee, the bitter warmth grounding him in the moment. "They don't understand," he said gently, "because they haven't had to." Thomas's lips curved in a faint, wry smile. "Yeah," he said, "but I think they're learning, one man at a time." Henry let that settle in the air between them, the quiet weight of it as steady as the rhythm of bears breathing at his feet. "That's all we can ask," he said, "that they learn to see, and to remember." The young men who had once laughed now sat in the hush of understanding, their gazes flicking up from their screens, their shoulders straightening beneath the quiet weight of respect. They didn't interrupt. They didn't try to fill the silence with apologies or explanations. They simply watched and listened. Thomas leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "The world doesn't need more noise," he said. "It needs more of this. More of the quiet moments where we remember what it cost, and why we stood." Henry nodded, the small motion enough. "That's why we're here," he said. "Not to be seen, but to stand, even when no one asks us to." Thomas's mouth lifted in a small smile, the warmth in his eyes a quiet echo of Henry's own. "And that's enough," he said. "Always has been." They sat together for a long time, the hush of the coffee shop wrapping around them like a gentle shield. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by something deeper, a soft, steady respect that spoke louder than any shout, because some bonds don't need words. Some debts don't need to be paid in gold or metals. Some are paid in the quiet of a shared silence, in the soft breath of understanding that lives in the hush of men who know how to stand. As the minutes turned to hours, the soft light of the winter morning shifted across the walls of the coffee shop. Henry and Thomas sat in companionable silence, the warm weight of their shared memories filling the hush. Henry let his thoughts drift, the steady pulse of bears breathing grounding him in the moment. But even as he sat there, his mind couldn't help but wander, back to the dusty roads of Vietnam, back to the tight heat of the jungle and the quiet prayers of young men who hadn't known if they'd see another sunrise. He saw the faces of the men he'd stood with, men who had laughed and cursed and fought beside him in the hush between the noise. He thought of one man in particular, Charlie Barnes, his best friend and the bravest man he'd ever known. Charlie's laughter had been bright even in the darkness, a quiet promise that they'd find a way home. But Charlie hadn't come home. Henry's hand tightened on his cane, the worn wood a small anchor in the gentle quiet of the coffee shop. Thomas watched him, his eyes steady and kind. "You're thinking of someone," Thomas said softly. Henry nodded, his gaze far away. "Charlie," he said. "He didn't make it, but he stood, right up until the end." Thomas let out a breath, his own memories flickering in the lines of his face. "I had one like that too," he said. "A brother in all but name. I still see him, in the quiet, in the hush when the world finally stops shouting." Henry met his gaze, the shared understanding a soft thread between them. "It never really leaves, does it?" he said. "No," Thomas said. "But maybe that's what keeps us standing, even now." The young men in suits had grown still, their eyes on the two old soldiers who spoke in soft words and long silences. One of them shifted, his voice a hesitant murmur. Did he die for something?" Henry looked up at him, his gaze calm and sure. "He died because he refused to sit down," he said. "Because some things matter more than comfort, more than fear." The young man swallowed, the quiet truth of those words settling deep in his chest. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Thomas reached across the table, his hand closing over Henry's with a quiet strength. "We're still here," he said, "for them, for the promise we made." Henry nodded, the small motion enough. "For them," he said softly. "Always for them." And in that moment, in the soft hush of a coffee shop on a winter morning, the laughter that had once filled the air was gone for good. In its place was the quiet echo of a promise that would never fade. Because some stands are paid for in blood, some debts are paid in silence, and some promises, the quiet ones, the steady ones, are paid in the breath of men who refuse to forget. The coffee shop was quiet as Henry rose from his seat, The soft scrape of the chair against the worn wood floor the only sound in the hush. Bear moved close to his leg, the dog's dark eyes calm and steady. Thomas stood too, his posture straight, the quiet strength of a soldier in every line of his shoulders. The young men in suits watched them, their eyes wide, their expressions a mixture of shame and something else, something like understanding. They didn't speak. They didn't try to fill the quiet with apologies or noise. They just watched, the weight of what they had seen written in the slow, uncertain rise of their breath. Henry nodded to them once, a small, sure gesture. "You don't have to be loud to be heard," he said. "You just have to stand." The words settled into the hush, a quiet promise that would echo long after the door closed behind him. He turned to Thomas, his mouth curving in a faint smile. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me that some debts are never truly paid." Thomas's own smile was small, but it reached his eyes. "It's what we do," he said. "It's who we are." They shook hands, no flourish, no ceremony. Just the simple, quiet clasp of two men who had seen the world at its worst and chosen to stand anyway. Then Henry stepped out into the winter air, Bear close at his side. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he welcomed it, the sharp edge of it a reminder that he was still here, still moving, still standing. The street was busy now, the city waking up in a swirl of cars and voices and the muted rhythm of hurried footsteps. But in the quiet of his own breath, Henry felt the calm surety of the promise he carried in his chest. Bear nudged his leg, his tail wagging once, the small movement a gentle echo of the bond they shared. Henry reached down, his hand brushing the thick fur, the warmth of it a quiet anchor in the morning chill. They walked slowly, each step a quiet defiance of the years, of the noise, of the world that had once thought it could laugh away what he had given. Each step was a simple promise. "I will not be moved." The city moved around them, the hush of the coffee shop left behind. But the weight of it, the quiet echo of it, stayed with Henry in every breath he took. He didn't need to look back. He didn't need to see the young men still sitting in the hush of understanding. He knew. Some stands didn't need to be seen to be remembered. Some debts didn't need to be paid in words. And some promises, the quiet ones, the steady ones, would echo long after the noise had faded. Because in the end, Henry knew the truth of it in the slow, steady rhythm of his own breath. No man who stands for what he believes in ever truly stands alone. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that respect isn't given, it's earned in the quiet hush of those who refuse to be moved, please subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video. Because some voices don't shout, they stand.